Okay, Bob, I thank you so much for that kind introduction. And today we're going to talk about the history of Donaldson Air Force Base. I'm going to spend 45 minutes and tell you all the history of Donaldson Air Force Base. Does anybody believe that? No, okay. But I'd like to do a quick overview, maybe start some conversations, and if any of you in the room today hear me saying something and realize I don't know what I'm talking about, call me out, okay? Because I've done a lot of research on this because it's a subject that's very dear to my heart. The history of Donaldson means a lot to me because as a teenager, I saw these events unfolding as they happened. Some truly amazing things happened at Donaldson in the 1950s. And I'm thrilled that so many of you here know about it, but so many people around Greenville aren't aware of this. So, but usually, all right, that's history, but usually any historical event had something that made it happen or caused it to happen or let it happen. And so in order to organize what I want to say today, I want to look at three historical narratives that intersected at Donaldson Air Force Base. First of all, we're going to look briefly at some of the historical events that paved the way that allowed Donaldson to become what it became. Donaldson didn't just happen. It was an amazing series of events that enabled Donaldson to be what it was. Second, we're going to look very briefly at a parallel narrative that a lot of people don't realize. We're going to look at worldwide, the history of scientific exploration and how it affected Donaldson. Believe it or not, there's a story there that goes way back to the 19th century. Then I'm briefly going to touch on the third historical narrative that relates to all of us in this room today. Slide 3. The first historical narrative, how Donaldson became what it was. I'd like to start by considering what three people have to tell us about how history touched Donaldson. First of all, we have Pulitzer Prize winning author David McCullough. Next, we have Greenville's own Dr. Courtney Tolleson-Hartness, who's a professor out at Furman right now. She did some work on this and had an excellent book that tells you a lot about Donaldson. But first of all, I'd like to talk about a Greenville native, philosopher, historian, someone who touched Greenville in many ways back in the 1950s up through the 60s, Mr. Doohickey. Does anybody remember Mr. Doohickey? Mr. Doohickey was a clown character on an afternoon children's TV show, Monty's Rascals. Do we have any of Monty's Rascals in the room? We have Monty's Rascals back here. Okay, great. Mr. Doohickey, and I would like to talk about his alter ego, Stowe Hoyle, the Atlantic gasoline weatherman. Every evening at 11 o'clock, Mr. Doohickey's alter, Stowe Hoyle, would tell us what weather is going to be for the next few days. After the weather forecast, the only thing left to do was to close another evening of TV broadcasting, because remember back then, television wasn't a 24-hour-a-day thing like it is now. And so after the weather forecast, they would play the national anthem and run a brief video clip, so a patriotic video clip of soldiers marching or airplanes taking off or something like that. Then after the sign-off, two things would appear on the screen that bore silent witness to something about Greenville. These two images would come up. It would celebrate Greenville as Textile Center of the world. Everybody remembers that. Greenville as Textile Center of the world. But also, some of you may remember, we would recognize Greenville as Airlift Capital of the world. What? Airlift Capital of the world? Greenville's textile manufacturing heritage is well known. But Airlift Capital of the world, that's pretty much gone now. Some infrastructure is still out at Donaldson, so you could go by and see it. But what do we mean by Airlift Capital of the world? Well, let me tell you. Donaldson Air Force Base operated a fleet of the most powerful transport airplanes in the world. It deployed them globally. It provided airlift support for many, if not most, world crises that came up during the Cold War period of 1953 through 1963. It showed the flag in far-flung places from Southeast Asia, Middle East, Europe, and even into downtown Moscow. That's quite a story that we'll touch on in just a minute. It was a major player in the International Geophysical Year's Antarctic mission, which was known as Operation Deep Freeze. That's something that, Deep Freeze, Operation Deep Freeze. We're going to look at that in a few minutes. Now, of course, this piece of history isn't something that just fell from the sky in 1953. Some things had to happen to make it possible for Donaldson to exist in the form that it did. So let's look at a little bit of background information. What did David McCullough have to tell us? Well, on April 16th, it was 2015, David McCullough gave a talk here at the Poinsett Club. He was in the other room down there. And his talk that evening was Leadership in the History You Don't Know. But he mentioned his upcoming book that he was going to soon be published on the Wright brothers. And the point I want to make here is that in this book, David McCullough described the Wright brothers as tinkerers, people who constantly tried to find a better way to do something. And that struck me because that pretty well represented American technology in the first part of the 20th century. They were always looking for a better way to do something. The result was, look at this progress. Can you believe that? From the day the Wright brothers got that powered flying kite to stay in the air for a few seconds, the Kitty Hawk, 32 years to the day Douglas first flew their DC-3 transport. DC-3 was an excellent airliner at the time. Last time I rode one was a couple years ago. It's a great little commuter airliner. They're still in military service today in several places around the world. Then, so the 1930s saw the development of reliable and useful airplanes. But as Dr. Donaldson tells us, I don't see her book right now, but in her book is World War II at Upcountry, South Carolina. She pointed out that more men died in training in the Army Air Force than in combat. Greenville Army Airfield killed more, crashed more airplanes and killed more pilots and crew members than the Germans and the Japanese together in their relative theater. Well, that isn't a reversal in ability. That was, of course, brought about because during World War II, the emphasis changed from let's build a better, more reliable airplane to let's build an airplane that can accomplish something better than the Axis power airplanes can do the same job. That, and also they were busy teaching a lot of overly enthusiastic young guys how to fly them. Well, books have been written on this subject. But for the sake of this presentation, let's ask, how did World War II engineering affect the future Donaldson Air Force Base? The answer is really pretty simple: horsepower. Remember that, horsepower, and lots of it. Early in World War II, actually before World War II, before the United States entered World War II, the Allies were scared to death that England would fall, and the Allies would no longer have access to the airfields in England to launch the strategic bombing raids against mainland Germany. So the Army Air Force asked the American aircraft industry to come up with a bomber that could, get this, 1940. They wanted something that could fly across the Atlantic Ocean, conduct a bombing run, and turn around and fly back. Yeah, right. Thanks for the laugh. Exactly. It was laughable. It was laughable in 1940. So the Army Air Force contracted with American designers to see if they could do it. They came up with the B-36 strategic bomber, America's big stick of the Cold War. England never fell. So the B-36 project was never put into operation until 1946, when they realized, oh, this thing could reach Moscow from the continental United States. The significance to the future Donaldson Air Force Base was that a new kind of very powerful engine had to be developed to power this airplane. This was going to give designers the ability to build really big transports that were later used at Donaldson. The significance for the future Donaldson Air Force Base was that a new kind of very powerful engine had to be developed to run this airplane. Now, you're going to hear me This is a disclaimer. You're going to hear me using imprecise terms like really big, really powerful. Just go with it, okay? We do have technical information, but you don't want to get into that. That's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. So, the situation facing American military aircraft builders after the war was, they knew how to build big, safe, reliable airplanes. They had done it in the 1930s. And they had a new generation of engines that provided enough power to make these things, I'm sorry, the only term I can think of is really big. Two things were going to happen for the transports to be developed and for Donaldson Air Force to become what it did become. First, the American aircraft industry needed to figure out, and this is important, how to use this new generation of engine to build huge airplanes that were safe and reliable. They couldn't have transport airplanes with the fatality rates that were experienced at these airfields, like Greenville Army Airfield during World War II. These things had to be safe and reliable. The second thing they had to do is they had to have a reason to do it. The things were going to be expensive. The B-36 project cost more than the Manhattan project, okay? And there was, I believe, I'm sure some of the folks in this room know about the revolt of the admirals. Has anybody ever heard of that? The admirals were very upset spending all that money on the B-36 because it meant they couldn't buy a new aircraft carrier. Making these airplanes big and reliable and safe to operate. Well, the new generation of the airplanes they were going to have to work out some problems. I was fortunate enough to know one upstate Air Force officer who played a significant role in sorting out these reliability issues. He was one of the many people who took the extreme engineering of World War II and used it to create powerful and reliable transport airplanes. Chief Warrant Officer Oliver Dibert was an electrical technician and flight engineer on B-24 bombers in the South Pacific during World War II. He explained to me how he dealt with one particular problem, and this is symptomatic of what these folks had to deal with. Working with the B-24s, there was a problem with the turbochargers. They needed turbochargers so the airplanes could fly at high altitudes and thin air and fly fast and long distances. The automatic system caused the turbochargers to overboost, and then the automatic system would overcorrect and they would drop the boost and the engine would lose power. When it was overboosting, there was a danger of destroying the engine. Underboost, it was hard to control the airplane. Chief Dibert, at the time, Tech Sergeant Dibert, came up with a solution. He bypassed the automatic system in the B-24 and replaced it with radio volume control knobs. He told me about how he scrounged volume control knobs from radios. And you know how you twist the knob to the right? It makes the radio louder. You twist it left to make it softer. He installed them on the flight engineer panel. You twist it to the right, it creates the boost, more boost. Twist it to the left, it reduces the boost. And the flight engineers were able to balance it out. Typical of the kind of folks that were operating at the time. After the war, Chief Dibert was assigned to the B-36 project developing maintenance procedures. It soon became evident that a big part of the B-36 maintenance would include anticipating which part might break and when it might break and replace it before it broke. So Chief Dibert became an expert in the new field of predictive failure analysis. He was listed as the co-author of the maintenance manual for the B-36. Soon his skills were needed to perform similar analyses for the C-124s at Donaldson Air Force Base. And Donaldson was fine with Chief Dibert because during the war, he had married a pretty girl from O'Neill community over near Greer. Everybody know where O'Neill is? And I'm proud to tell you that Holler was my father-in-law. Great man. A reason to build them. We're going to talk about the Berlin airlift real quickly. During World War II, the really big airplanes were bombers. Transports were smaller and were usually militarized versions of commercial transports. The Berlin airlift was a huge event that focused attention on military air transportation. You all know that at the end of World War II, Germany was divided up into sectors. East Germany was under the control of the Soviet Union, West Germany, United States, Britain, and France. Well, Berlin, of course, was in the eastern sector, and the access into and out of Berlin was down the Autobahn. The Allies assumed they could just jump on the Autobahn with trucks or whatever, drive over to Berlin when they needed to. There was also a rail line, and I believe a canal going in and out of Berlin. Well, in 1946, England, France, and the United States united their three zones into one economic zone with a common currency. Of course, that made Stalin mad because Stalin got mad about things. So he blockaded Berlin, said you can't come across the border into East Berlin and have access anymore. The result was the Berlin airlift of March 1948 through April 1949. And I'm sure all of you know that through the Berlin airlift, the Allies were able to keep the city afloat. Now, how is this important to Donaldson Air Force Base? Experience gained during Operation Vittles, the code name for the Berlin airlift, showed that the airlift operations alone could be used to influence international events. Here, the bombers could remain silent while transports did the work. This gave the concept of military airlift a whole new meaning. The transports were strategic tools, not just the tactical tools they had been previously. This was a big deal if you want to avoid wars. Also, there were some practical and technical lessons learned through all this. The new series of transport planes would have to have flat cargo floors, no more tail draggers like the old C-47. They had to have big front or rear facing doors. They had to have winches and cranes to lift heavy items aboard, and they had to be able to get into and out of small and unimproved airfields. These lessons took flight in November 27th, 1949 was the actual date, in the form of the C-124 Globemaster II. The Globemaster I had been a similar airplane, but it didn't have the door features and the winches and things like that. And so, up to Donaldson Air Force Base. In 1953, when the 63rd Troop Carrier Wing and their C-124s were assigned to Donaldson, they brought with them a well-thought-out, state-of-the-art transport aircraft, the C-124, that was big, powerful, reliable, and safe. They brought with them an operational doctrine developed through significant experience with Cold War political realities, with the Berlin airlift and other events. And they brought with them a generation of people who, and the best way I know to say it is a quote, people who were born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard, brittle, and bitter peace, and proud of their heritage. And folks, the people they took to Donaldson knew how to do stuff. They were an amazing group of people. At this point, I'd like to switch over and read from, or work from some firsthand information from my friend, Captain Brock Jackson. Brock was a C-124 pilot at Donaldson, and he gave me, of course, a good bit of information on this. Brock tells us that the 63rd Troop Carrier Wing's motto, anything, anywhere, anytime, captured the nature of the mission. He said, even though they were initially organized under the Tactical Air Command, he said their primary mission was strategic air support, strategic for whatever the Department of Defense needed to take care of anywhere in the world. He went on to describe the airplane. The total horsepower on the C-124 is 16,200 horsepower. Folks, those things weren't flying trucks. They were flying freight trains. They were amazing machines. This was the 1950s, remember. Had the two large clamshell doors in the nose with a hydraulic actuated ramp at the front of the aircraft so they could easily get cargo in and out. Could lift over 68,000 pounds on a 77-foot-long cargo bay. Had overhead hoist that could lift 16,000 pounds. The thing could fly 7,000 miles. This was the 1950s. It could carry all kinds of equipment, including it could haul 200 fully equipped troops. I can attest to that because I was one of the 200 that rode in and out of Vietnam on these things several times. It was quite a ride. They were shaky, let me tell you. Something that was significant It was the only aircraft at the time that was capable of lifting a tank. And the Soviets knew it. You bet the Soviets knew it.
Was that one tank per aircraft?
Probably one craft, depending on the size of the tank. There were smaller tanks where they could manage two, but the larger battle tanks, there was one at a time. But at least they could do it. And the Soviets definitely knew that. And I don't dare diverge into that story because Donaldson kept the C-124s running far past the time they should have kept them operating, simply because they could lift the tank and the Air Force had not been able to come up with a new transport that was capable of lifting a tank. I remember as a kid, Dad showed me the cracks in the structural members of the C-124s. And they were hoping they could keep them together just for that one feature. Okay, again, Brock Jackson telling us about this. Geographic range of missions. Brock says that he often told people, and I remember folks talking about this, he often told people that the people at Donaldson were the second to know of any impending global event or crisis. The first people are the ones that happened to anywhere in the world. The second people were the folks at Donaldson who knew they were going to have to haul equipment and supplies to this event to fix the problem. They deployed all over the world for political, strategic, and humanitarian missions. They took part in building the distant early warning line, DEW line. And this is kind of significant. They developed considerable experience operating these things with heavy loads of technical equipment. They would fly into places like this where the locals would come riding out of the forest on a horse to see what was happening. Okay? It was amazing, some of the missions they inherited. Brock told us about one time he was flying back and forth the DEW line and always carrying equipment built by, I believe it was Western Electric, the radar equipment. He said one time he showed up and they had an entire airplane load of onions. All the mess halls up there needed onions. So it was always something going on. I'm sorry to go by notes, but there's so much to cover today that I want to make sure I stay on track. Today, the DEW line is still part of NORAD. Today, it's called the North Warning System. Additional machine. Additional missions that they flew in and out of Lebanon, Beirut. Humanitarian and troops. When was the last time we heard about a crisis in Lebanon? Does anybody remember? I remember at Greenville News last week telling us something about it. It's still going on. They were taking care of problems in Lebanon at that time. Kimomatsu, I believe that's how you say the name of those two little islands. They're to the west of Taiwan, close to mainland China. In 1958, mainland China started lobbing artillery shells over these two little islands. And of course, we couldn't have that because mainland China is communist and that was threatening Taiwan. So Donaldson was called on to fly out to Hamilton Air Force Base, California, and load up an entire squadron of F-104 fighters and deliver those F-104s to Taiwan so they could get the Chinese to stop lobbing artillery rounds. Now that was significant because this operation marked a historical milestone. It was the first time that a complete Air Force squadron was airlifted in a single package operation. Donaldson Air Force Base in the 1950s could pick up an entire fighter squadron and deliver it anywhere in the world that it was needed in the 1950s. Folks, given the times, that was amazing. Belgian Congo, they were always in and out of Belgian Congo. Moscow. Let's see if I can find the Moscow. Moscow. They had a mission to Moscow. Ambassador Charles Bolin was our ambassador in Moscow. John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State at the time, I believe. Nikita Khrushchev was Nikita Khrushchev. What had happened, there was some disagreement between the Hawks and the Doves, and Ambassador Bolin was being recalled. For whatever reason, Eisenhower recalled him to Washington. So we decided to make a Cold War statement out of this. So instead of just sending Ambassador Bolin airline ticket to fly back, they dispatched a C-124 from Donaldson to fly into downtown Moscow. okay? Military transport planes, as some of you know, have tracks in the floors where you can slide stuff on the tracks. You can slide pallets or cargo and lock the pallets in place. Well, they also have modules. It might be a refrigerator module, just like a big refrigerator unit can be slid in and locked into place if we need to take refrigerated stuff somewhere in the world. It can be a medical operating room. Well, with this C-124, they tricked it out with some modules. One module was a little living room office combination. The next module back was a little bedroom kitchen combination. Behind that, they had a little bathroom. Ambassador Bolin was going to fly back in style. The point of the mission was, they flew into Moscow, taxied it up to the ramp. Those big engines swinging those propellers, believe me, that was impressive in the day. They flew up, they stopped. They opened those big clamshell doors. They extended the hydraulic ramp from the front of the airplane. Then a little truck from the embassy, American embassy there in Moscow, the Dodge Power Wagon, backed up into this thing. Backed it far enough so that it disappeared into the shadows. Well, they threw suitcases and a couple other things in the back of the truck, drove out and went over to the embassy. But Brock knew some of the fellows who were involved in the mission. And he said that the Soviet officials were standing there because the Soviets had nothing that could match that. Yeah, they picked up Ambassador Bolin, but it was a Cold War mission that was beautifully choreographed. Many people today still believe that Charles Lindbergh flew that thing across the Atlantic Ocean. Okay. This is obviously an air show when somebody parked that replica of the Spirit of St. Louis by the C-124. They didn't really carry Charles Lindbergh, I promise. Okay. Okay. The second historical narrative, and believe it or not, we're going to talk for just a few minutes about the history of scientific exploration. In 1956, the people in C-124s at Donaldson had earned their stripes. They had shown that they could go any place, anytime, anywhere, and take care of any mission that was thrown at them, be it Arctic cold, politically sensitive areas, hot, dusty regions. Then something truly remarkable happened. The 63rd Troop Carrier Wing was called on to help science explore the last frontiers of our planet. And it all started back in the 19th century with the Austro-Hungarian expedition of 1892-1894. This fellow, Austrian Navy Lieutenant Karl Weypershay, was a member of an expedition trying to find a northeast passage over the top of Russia and Europe. Well, it didn't work. There's nothing but ice up there, of course. He got stuck in the ice. The ship was being crushed. Well, while the ship was being crushed, that gave Weypershay plenty of time to think. You know, you're on a ship about to sink. One, how are we going to get out of here? And then when I get back, how am I going to explain what happened to this expensive boat they gave me? Well, sometimes it's best just to divert attention from what actually happened. So Weypershay amazingly was able to escape, got back. He and his men pulled sleds and a lifeboat across the ice to open water and then rowed back, I think, to northern Scandinavia. Anyway, he lived and was able to present his ideas back up. He decided, he came up with the idea that countries should cooperate to place scientific stations at strategic locations around the Arctic in order to study weather, terrestrial magnetism, and other phenomena, and to do this over a span of at least a year. Well, he was able to return and presented those ideas at the meeting of German naturalists and physicists in Graz, Austria in 1875. His ideas indeed saw fruition with the International Polar Year of 1882 and 83. Good scientific work was done, including the first study of the Aurora Borealis. Weypershay died in 1881. He was killed in action. But due to the success of his scientific cooperation, listen to this. Due to the success of the scientific cooperation, his ideas lived on in the Second International Polar Year, which was held 50 years later in 1932 and 33. Remember those dates, 32, 33. The third International Polar Year was planned for the years 1982 and 83. Well, now obviously in that time frame, amazing changes in technology and science were going to take place. Rockets, airplanes, radar transportation. Well, by the time we get to the early 1950s, the world was different from what Webershey had seen. All these changes that had come along, we had advancements, but then, on top of everything else, the sun started acting up. Sun started acting up. Well, a group of scientists thought they could decide they would try to leverage all this to organize a new year of scientific exploration. James Van Allen, the rocket expert. You've heard of the Van Allen radiation belt around our Earth. Sidney Chapman, renowned expert in geophysics. Lloyd Berkner, whose specialty included ionospheric physics and telecommunication. These guys got together, and I promise this is leading to Donaldson. These guys got together and convinced the worldwide scientific community to move the 1982-83 polar year to 1957-58 and change the name to the International Geophysical Year. Anybody remember reading about that in your weekly reader while I've been in elementary school? I remember, okay? They convinced the scientific community. They also convinced 67 countries to go along with their idea and make it happen, including the United States. The United States agreed to let the United States Navy provide the logistical support for Antarctic exploration. So just what was the International Geophysical Year? Well, quoting Sidney Chapman from his book, IGY, I have here somewhere. Sidney Chapman said, the major aim of the International Geophysical Year was to improve knowledge and understanding of the Earth and its more rapid changes. Simply put, they studied and recorded things that could be observed on a day-to-day basis, not events that occurred on a geologic timescale. They developed baseline data that would serve as reference for later work. For example, studying global climate change in the 21st century. This was in the 1950s, 57, 58, is when they laid down the baseline data. The Navy's part of the operation was Task Force 43. I've had a major failure of the laser pointer, but being prepared, I brought two. Task Force 43. Task Force 43 was going to be commanded by his fellow Admiral George Dufek. I believe I have his picture in here. Admiral Dufek had had a distinguished Navy career. He retired and he was ready for retirement. Well, the Navy wanted an admiral to command this operation in Antarctica, but they didn't want a full-time regular Navy admiral because this was technically a scientific operation, not scientific, not military. So Admiral Dufek retired, and then 5 minutes as a captain. 5 minutes later, he was reactivated as a reserve rear admiral and took charge of Task Force 43. Now I'm going to refer back to what Brock Jackson had told me about the International Geophysical Year. It was, there were 12, at least in Antarctica, there were 12 participating nations, established approximately 50 scientific stations in Antarctica. US was involved in 6, including a joint station with New Zealand. President Eisenhower had approved a US participation because, remember, this was during the height of the Cold War. And while Russia would be a scientific partner, it was also a hostile nation. Basically, International Geophysical Year was successful with all these different governments taking part because nobody wanted to be left out. Everybody wanted to know what everybody else was doing for fear there would be some kind of military activity. Okay, the Navy was given overall logistical command because they had icebreakers. Come on, they had icebreakers and big cargo ships that could carry equipment down to Antarctica. But because of the capabilities like the C-124, the US Air Force would be responsible for airdropping fuel, food, and other supplies to several remote IGY sites. Of course, there were no landing facilities in Antarctica. The Navy had ski-equipped aircraft, but their airplanes were too small to carry significant loads of supplies to these forward sites. The 63rd Troop Carrier Wing at Donaldson was selected because of their extensive Arctic experience gained through dew line and other things. And they conducted kind of a pre-run in October 1955. They went to northern Greenland to learn how to refine their skills, and they realized they were going to have to use some outside-of-the-box techniques in order to supply stations in Antarctica. They flew down to Antarctica, and New Zealand, of course, was the staging point for flying on into Antarctica. Now, New Zealand was kind of significant to Donaldson for several reasons, because every one of these guys that I've ever talked to fell in love with New Zealand. They loved it. So I have more slides of New Zealand than I know what to do with. The 63rd would set up open house days there at the air base where they were stationed in New Zealand. The folks from the locals would come out, they'd dress up in their Sunday best. They always had a band playing. The people in New Zealand loved it. They came out and just swarmed all over these fellows. And of course, the airmen ate it up. They adored it. Brock Jackson told me he bought this old car so he could get around New Zealand and visit and see things. As they left New Zealand and started flying down toward Antarctica, the first thing they experienced was the pancake ice. They knew this was getting serious. That was cold, and there was no turning back. That was their first experience. Antarctica itself, of course, is a bunch of rocks coming up out of the ocean. The Navy deliberately froze some ships in there because they could be storage depots, they could be fuel tanks, and could be quite useful for the operation. When they arrived in Antarctica, here's a picture of the landing zone. Folks, that's the end of a glacier. It's an ice shelf sticking out into the ocean. It was smooth enough to land because, of course, the base itself was up on the Antarctic rocks. That was too rough. You can't land an airplane up there. So they landed out on the ice shelf, and they figured the ice was probably thick enough so it wouldn't break. Surely it won't break. Maybe it won't break. Well, it never broke. It actually supported the airplanes. What do we get into here? They were there to stay. That was what was significant about the mission in 1957 and 58, because they were in Antarctica to stay, and this was at the air base there at McMurdo Sound. When they would leave McMurdo going to the pole, the pilots told me that they would fly down this Beardmore Glacier. It was called Beardmore, some English explorer. They said if they got lined up on Beardmore and just kept going, they'd get to the South Pole with no problem. So that's what navigation was like. Now, South Pole. On December 14th, 1911, the five-man expedition led by Roald Amundsen, there's a Norwegian expedition. Roald and his people reached the South Pole. They all returned safely. Amundsen was very interested in exploration, and he understood his logistics. He was able to get his overland people. They walked to the South Pole, and they left enough equipment behind them so they had food and fuel to get back, and they lived. Just over a month later, the five-man Terra Nova expedition, led by British Navy Captain Robert Falcon Scott, reached the pole. They all died on the return journey. Scott let his concern with scientific exploration, which was kind of what was necessary to justify funding for the expedition. He let it get away from him, and logistics got out of hand, and they couldn't find their food and fuel on the way back. They all died. So 10 men had reached the South Pole. 5 of them had lived to tell the tale. When human being number 11 stepped out on the South Pole, that was Admiral Dufek. He stepped out of this little airplane. He recognized that it's another DC-3, just like we had talked about earlier. Admiral Dufek stepped out on the South Pole and declared intentions to build a base and stay. When he stepped out on the South Pole, a C-124 from Donaldson Air Force Base was circling overhead in case they got into trouble and needed assistance. When humankind reached the last limit of our planet, with intention to stay, Donaldson Air Force Base was right there. And we're not talking about abstract history. If you would like to, that airplane, if you would like to see the hangar where that airplane was prepped, ride out to Donaldson this afternoon. It's still standing there. If you would like to see the runway that airplane took off from, it's out there. You land on it all the time, right? Right. That's an amazing piece of Greenville history, the way I see it. To give you an idea of the scope of this mission, let's see, there's something else I need to talk about. Here's a picture of the South Pole taken a few months later. My dad took that shot out at the bottom of the airplane. You can see where the South Pole is. It's inside that ring. That's the ring of oil drums they set up to say the South Pole is somewhere right in here. Oh yeah, navigation over Antarctica. They get to the South Pole either overland or in these airplanes. Then they had to get back. Okay, how do you get back to where you're going? Well, you go north. Okay, north. Well, wait a minute. That way's north. Okay. Everything's north. Okay, so they put up a grid over Antarctica, and it was artificial north. South Pole, and then grid north is the direction of the Greenwich meridian, the zero meridian going to Greenwich, England. So to get from the South Pole back to the American Air Base at McMurdo Sound, they would fly the north that's called south. To get to the South Pole, they'd fly the south that's called north. It worked, don't worry, they found their way around. The fellows, of course, just had a fit wanting to take photographs while they were down there. They all had to get a picture of the midnight sun, of course. There's Brock Jackson standing outside the bathhouse. He said you could actually get a shower and not freeze to death. Brock wanted me to include this fellow because he was a pilot, went down there, never made it back. He fell in love with a New Zealand girl, never came back. Still down there. Oh, everybody had to fly over the volcano. Yes, McMurdo Sound has a volcano, Mount Erebus. Everybody had to fly over the volcano and look down into it and take a picture of the volcano. So that was a big deal for the folks down there. Now, to give you an idea of the significance of what was going on, I have these 4 photographs. Up here, here's some Donaldson folks talking to Paul Sipple. Remember when I told you about the Arctic expedition of 1932-33? Sipple was an Eagle Scout at that time, and he was selected to accompany Admiral Byrd on the Antarctic expedition as an Eagle Scout, as kind of an observer. There was a book written about him. It was one of my childhood hero books with Byrd at the South Pole. Sipple went ahead, and his career was with developing cold weather equipment for the Army. Paul Sipple developed the wind chill factor. We're going to start hearing wind chill factor on the evening weather forecast when it starts getting cold up in Asheville. Sipple developed that. The next fellow, Sir George Hubert Wilkins. To give you an idea of the kind of people that were down there, Wilkins, in the early 1920s, Wilkins convinced the United States Navy to give him a submarine. Sure, why not? They gave him a leftover submarine, and he used it to figure out how to get under the Arctic ice. Why not? He went on, he had a career as an explorer and a soldier, and he was a bit of a bird expert and a fine photographer. When he died, the Navy took his ashes to the North Pole aboard the submarine, nuclear submarine Skate, and scattered his ashes at the pole. This shot right here, my dad talking to Congressman Harris, Ord Harris, Democrat of Arkansas. Dad was born in Little Rock. Congress was very interested in what was going on, so they constantly had a delegation down there to see what was happening, see what the Donaldson, everybody, including the Donaldson folks, were doing. On that particular mission, Congressman Harris had hitched a ride on the C-124. They did an airdrop at one of the remote sites, and what happened was a parachute snagged on the bottom of the drop well. So this C-124 had a dang parachute dragging behind it. Well, C-124s are pretty powerful, but it was going to have trouble hauling that parachute back to McMurdo Sound. So Dad hollered at a guy, one of the other loadmasters, a guy named Wilkins, and I met Wilkins later, big guy, about 6'6", strong as a mule. He grabbed Dad by the ankles, held him down in the elevator well, and Dad cut the parachute loose with a knife, saved the airplane. And here was Congressman Harris, saw this whole thing. So that's why Dad's standing there looking all, oh, he was really living it up that day. He wound up with the Air Medal out of the deal. Sir Edmund Hillary, does anybody, I'm sure some of y'all know who Edmund Hillary. He and his friend Tenzing Norgay were the first two people to climb Mount Everest in 1953. Ed Hillary, Dad said he was the nicest guy, Ed, he was down there with the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition. England had an expedition coming from the other side of Antarctica, was going to come across by land using tractors, go to the South Pole, then come on across to the American base at McMurdo. That was to be the first trans-Antarctic expedition. So Ed Hillary's job was to put caches, supply caches between McMurdo and the South Pole, food, fuel, whatever was needed. He used tractors to do it. He got out there, he put the last cache into place. It was maybe 100 miles from the pole. Then he was supposed to contact the expedition by radio for further instructions. They were going to tell him to either stand tight or go back. Edmund Hillary, he was a rascal, okay? Do you think the radio worked that day? Oh no, that radio didn't work. It was a garbled transmission. He said, oh, I thought you told me to go into the pole, so I'd be the first person since the original two in 1911 and 12 to get to the South Pole, plus the first person ever to use mechanized equipment to get to the South Pole. That was me. He got down there, so they put him on an airplane and sent him back to McMurdo and told him to behave. But he was quite a guy. Those are the kind of people the Donaldson folks were dealing with in Antarctica. So, here we are in Antarctica. Oops, 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 oops. Sorry, having to kind of make do with something. Here we are in Antarctica. United States Navy, United States Air Force, other countries and organizations have mustered resources to support probably one of the biggest scientific endeavors ever attempted by man. Excuse me, I get tongue-tied on this with a dry mouth. The most advanced transport airplanes in the world are loaded and ready to deliver desperately needed supplies and scientific instruments to the South Pole, to the very end of the world. This is an enormous operation. So what do you think is going to happen next? Anybody have any idea? The dang thing won't start. That's what's going to happen next. Or they say, well, don't worry, we got another one over here, we'll use it. Try the other one. It's got a flat tire. Okay? This is what we call logistics. Suddenly, the guy with a toolbox who knows what to do becomes the most important person in the entire chain. And in previous talks, I would introduce my friend, retired Master Sergeant John Mall. John was an engine mechanic and a flight engineer on the C-124s down there. John did not make it through the COVID pandemic, and he is missed tremendously. An arcane area of learning continues to take place on this frozen continent. Logistics. On the ice, every bite of food, every pair of socks, every watt of electricity, every gallon of fuel, every nut, bolt, and nail is not only a matter of life and death, but it's also a logistical nightmare. And it's a logistician's opportunity. In Antarctica, the process of getting the right stuff to the right place at the right time offers not only unique challenges, but unique opportunities. Obviously, the place is remote, cold, slippery, and windy. But the supply chain can be put in place, and we can see how it works. There's no outside interference. Military supply chains, as I'm sure many of you know, are rife with corruption, people stealing, people misappropriating stuff, material going this way and that, going everywhere in the world. Well, in Antarctica, there's no place to take it. So the supply chain can be put into place, and the logistical system can be developed to see how it works. If NASA wants to study logistics and preparation, say, for a mission to Mars, this is the place to go. and see how the logistical system will work. And we have plenty of photographs talking about that. You can see equipment was just left everywhere. Well, nobody's going to steal it. They broke a C-124. They crashed it. They used it as a storage shed for the explosives used in seismic experiments. When winter was coming, they would put tall poles beside different caches of supplies with color-coded flags on the top of the poles. So when the snow covered up the supplies, they would at least be able to find them by looking for the pole that still had the flag on top. And it worked out pretty well. In 1939 and 40, they took this thing down, the snow cruiser. Well, they didn't do sufficient research on it before they took it down. Those tires didn't have enough traction to move around in the snow, so this thing was basically useless. And it was still sitting there in the 50s when guys got down there. Since then, it was on a piece of ice that broke off, went out in the ocean and sunk. Dad had been on the crew that developed heavy airdrop. They had developed a technique for dropping Caterpillar tractors, and the tractor was needed at the South Pole. So Dad was a drop master, flew down to the South Pole, and they made the drop of this Caterpillar. Well, the drop seemed to go well, but just as the parachutes deployed, the risers, the nylon straps that connect the load to the parachute, broke. They snapped and dumped the tractor, dumped it in the ice. They said, we've done this over and over, what's wrong? They finally realized that the cold temperatures were different from what had ever been encountered before, and the nylon had become brittle. When it hit those sharp edges on the side of the tractor, there were plenty of opportunities for it to snap and break. So what Dad did was put sheets of plywood and padding on the side of a tractor and tried it again, and it worked out just fine. They were able to make the drop successfully. Back in the day, Chris, could you hold up the airplane just a minute, please? Back in these days, remember, this was the first generation of heavy air transports. They did not have the door at the back like you see in airplanes today. They had a hole at the bottom of the cockpit of an airplane. This thing was basically the logical evolution of a World War II bomber. The cargo would be dropped right out the bottom of the airplane. And I've never been able to find an actual video. I came across this on a VHS tape and was able to extract it. You can see that it's dropped out of the bottom of the old C-124. And then would stand there and watch. Yeah, it's going to hit at the right place. Now, anyone who's familiar with the modern transport will think this is quite primitive and quaint. But let me tell you, in the late 1950s, this was a trick. Those guys were accomplishing amazing things. Thank you. Admiral Dufek realized that this was going to be some kind of operation. So he took a couple of artists down there with him. This fellow, Standish Backus, was actually in the Navy Reserve. He did this somewhat abstract painting of an icebreaker pulling a barge just off the coast of Antarctica. This fellow, I believe Charles Hahn is, I believe, how his name is used. Sometimes a painter can get a better rendition of what's going on than a photographer can, because all the light can always be perfect. And so Charles Hahn went down and illustrated how the cargo was lifted off of the Navy ships and hauled into the base there. So, Operation Deep Freeze. Donaldson Air Force Base helped set this up. They were instrumental in making Operation Deep Freeze successful. The current season was launched just a couple of weeks ago. It's been transferred out to Fort Lewis McChord, Washington now. And they have much more modern airplanes than what they had back in the day. But we can be proud of the fact that Donaldson was right there at the beginning and helped get this started. Now, I'm going to skip over this part. Peacekeepers. This is something that means a lot to me. Anybody who's ever a veteran and seen people fighting